In a world overwhelmed by the noise of everyday life, some loves go unnoticed, only known to those whose hearts are in tune with one another. This is a love story not told through grand gestures or eloquent speeches, but through quiet moments of understanding, sacrifice, and a bond that transcends the need for words. Journey with us as we explore how two souls connected in ways that words could never describe, finding a love that was always felt, even when it could not be spoken. In the midst of a world that constantly demands our attention, two souls found each other not by chance, but by a force so deep it could only be described as destiny. Their love story didn't start with a grand declaration or a bold confession. It began in the quiet spaces between the noise, where silence spoke volumes, and in those moments, their hearts communicated in ways words never could. Their first meeting was nothing more than a fleeting moment, an interaction that seemed ordinary to everyone else but felt profoundly significant to them. It was in a crowded coffee shop, the type where people gathered for their daily dose of caffeine, but this time there was something different. As their eyes met across the room, something shifted. It wasn't love at first sight in the traditional sense, but something just as powerful. It was as if, for the first time, they were both truly seen. For him, there was an overwhelming sense of recognition. He had seen countless faces, countless smiles, but her smile, her eyes, held a depth he couldn't explain. He had always felt like an observer in the world, disconnected in many ways, but in that instant, he felt like he had found something, someone, who understood him in a way no one ever had. It wasn't the kind of connection you could quantify or rationalize. It was a quiet understanding, an unspoken bond that grew silently between them. For her, it was as if a weight had been lifted. She had always been the quiet one, the one who blended into the background, never drawing attention to herself. But in his gaze, she felt something stir, an unfamiliar warmth, a silent promise that there was more to life than what she had been living. She had lived much of her life surrounded by noise, but in this moment, everything became still. It was a quiet kind of love that whispered to her heart, something she didn't fully understand but felt was important. There was no dramatic exchange of words, no immediate promise of forever. Instead, there was a shared smile, a moment that stretched longer than it should have, and in that unspoken connection. In the serene tranquility of their shared space, they sat together, without the need for words. The world around them continued its bustling rhythm, but for them, time seemed to stand still. Every small movement, every glance, spoke volumes about their connection. He could sense her presence, without seeing her face. The way her breath fell in sync with his, the quiet rustle of her dress as she shifted slightly. Everything was a quiet conversation of its own. And in the stillness of it all, something unspoken passed between them. It was an understanding that didn't need to be defined. Their connection was so deep, so profound, that words seemed unnecessary. They didn't need to fill the air with unnecessary chatter. They understood each other in ways that most people would struggle to articulate. And it wasn't just about shared experiences or mutual interests. It was something more profound. Something that transcended what the world expected. She looked at him in a way that made him feel seen, really seen, no judgments, no pretenses. Her gaze was kind and full of understanding. There was no need for her to ask how he felt. She already knew. Her quiet empathy filled the spaces between them, and in that moment, he felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. It was as if all the unspoken fears, doubts, and anxieties melted away in her presence. He, too, had always known what she needed, even when she didn't say a word. Whether it was a hand to hold or a gentle touch on the shoulder, he understood the comfort she sought. It wasn't always easy to put into words, but somehow, their silent communication was enough. The gestures, the small acts of kindness, they spoke louder than any grand proclamation ever could. This understanding wasn't rushed. It wasn't something that could be forced. It grew gradually over time, nurtured by the shared moments of togetherness. And with every quiet exchange, it blossomed into something more beautiful than either of them had expected. They didn't need to ask for reassurance. They didn't need to demand attention. Their bond was built on trust, trust that they would always be there for each other, even in the silence. And it was in that silence that they truly found peace. For him, it was a relief to know that someone could understand him without the need for constant validation. In the busy world outside, he often felt like a small piece in a puzzle too big to comprehend. But when he was with her, that feeling faded. She didn't need him to be anyone other than himself. She didn't ask for grand gestures or constant reassurance. She simply existed, quietly and consistently, in a way that calmed the storm inside him.
For her, it was the same.
Life had always been a whirlwind of activity, and sometimes the noise of the world grew too loud. But when she was with him, it felt as if the noise faded into the background. His presence was a quiet refuge where she could finally breathe. There was no pressure to perform or pretend. They simply were. The unspoken understanding between them was a dance, a rhythm that they both followed, without even realizing it. Their connection was an intricate pattern of gestures, glances, and emotions, weaving together to create something beautiful. It was a quiet harmony that spoke to the depth of their bond. And in the moments where the world felt overwhelming, they knew that they could rely on this connection. They didn't need to say anything, they just needed to be with each other. No words were necessary to express the depth of their feelings. Every silence between them was filled with meaning. Every pause was a conversation of its own. When they shared a laugh, it wasn't just about the joke. It was about the shared joy of being in the same moment, together. When they sat in silence, it wasn't awkward. It was a comfortable pause, like the world had slowed down just for them. And in every shared experience, they found themselves growing closer, more attuned to one another. As the evening wore on, the light outside began to fade, and they remained in their quiet space. There was no rush to leave, no need to fill the air with words. Their connection was enough. In that stillness, they understood each other in ways that no one else could. And in that quiet, they both found peace. The unspoken understanding between them wasn't just about love. It was about trust, about being seen without needing to explain, about knowing that someone would always be there, even without words. It was a bond that transcended the limits of language and was rooted deeply in the heart. And in that quiet understanding, they both knew they had found something extraordinary. Something that needed no explanation because it was simply understood. The road ahead was not an easy one, but they had both known that from the very start. The trials they faced were numerous, each one more challenging than the last. The weight of the world seemed to press down on them, but together, they remained steadfast. In the face of adversity, they found a strength they didn't know they possessed. Every obstacle that came their way was just another test, another chance to prove that their bond was unbreakable. At times, they would find themselves questioning whether they could continue. The struggles felt endless, as though the universe was pushing them further apart. Yet, even in the darkest moments, they held on to one another, finding solace in their shared resolve. They knew that love wasn't always easy. It wasn't something that could simply be taken for granted. It required effort, patience, and understanding, qualities that both of them were learning to cultivate. The first trial came early on. There had been a misunderstanding, one that neither of them had expected. Words were exchanged, emotions ran high, and for a moment, it seemed as though the fragile connection they had built was teetering on the edge of collapse. It felt like everything was unraveling, and the fear of losing each other gripped their hearts. But it was in that moment of vulnerability that they truly understood the depth of their commitment. They talked for hours, not just about what had happened, but about what they needed from each other. They listened, really listened, and began to understand the fears and insecurities that had been hidden beneath the surface. It wasn't just about resolving the immediate conflict. It was about understanding each other on a deeper level, about acknowledging their differences, and finding a way to move forward together. They made a promise to each other that day. No matter what came their way, they would face it together. They would never let fear or misunderstanding come between them again. They would communicate, support one another, and never take the other for granted. It was a promise that would guide them through the trials to come. The next challenge came in the form of external pressures. Life had a way of throwing curveballs when least expected. Family, work, friends, everyone had their own expectations of them, and it often felt like the weight of the world was bearing down on their shoulders. There were moments when the demands of daily life seemed insurmountable, and the world around them felt like it was moving at a pace they couldn't keep up with. But it was in these moments of stress that they found strength in one another. They learned to lean on each other, offering comfort and reassurance when the world felt too overwhelming. There were times when one of them would be on the verge of giving up, but the other would always be there to lift them up, to remind them of their worth, and to help them refocus on the love that bound them together. It wasn't easy. There were days when they felt defeated, when it seemed like the weight of their responsibilities was too much to bear. But in the quiet moments, when they were together, they found solace. They learned that it wasn't the big moments that mattered most. It was the small, everyday acts of love and kindness that made all the difference. A gentle touch, a soft word, a quiet understanding. These were the things that held them together when everything else felt like it was falling apart. But the real test came when they were faced with a personal crisis, something that neither of them could have predicted. It shook them to their core, leaving them feeling vulnerable and lost. In those moments, they both had to confront their deepest fears and doubts. They had to face the possibility that their love, no matter how strong, might not be enough to carry them through. But even in their darkest hour, they didn't give up on each other. They fought for their love, not in the dramatic way that stories might tell, but in the quiet, everyday moments. They learned to be there for one another, to hold each other up even when it felt like the ground was shifting beneath them. They faced their fears together, and slowly, with time and patience, they began to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but with each passing day, they grew stronger, more resilient. Through the trials and tribulations, they learned that love wasn't just about the good times. It wasn't just about the laughter, the joy, or the moments of happiness. Love was about showing up when it mattered most, when things were difficult, when the world seemed overwhelming, and when they were at their lowest. It was about being there for each other, even when it felt like everything else was falling apart. And as they stood together, looking out at the horizon, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The road ahead might be uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they knew they could overcome anything. Love, after all, was about more than just surviving. It was about thriving together, no matter the challenges life threw their way. And with each passing day, they became more certain that their love was unbreakable, forged in the fire of adversity and strengthened by the trials they had faced together. The unexpected test came when they least expected it, catching them off guard, testing not only their relationship, but their individual resolve. The world they knew was suddenly turned upside down, and both of them found themselves questioning everything they had once believed about each other and the connection they shared. It began innocuously enough with a phone call late one evening. Her best friend, someone who had always been a constant presence in her life, called in tears, overwhelmed by a situation she couldn't handle alone. She needed help, she needed a safe place. Without hesitation, they both agreed to offer their support. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few days of helping a friend in need, but things quickly spiraled beyond their control. At first, it seemed like a simple act of kindness. They were happy to help, eager to offer their time and comfort to someone they cared about. But the more their friend stayed with them, the more their peaceful world began to fray. The lines between duty and love, friendship and partnership, began to blur in ways they never anticipated. Their home, once a sanctuary, now felt crowded, stifling, and suffocating. The tension in the air was palpable. The things they had once taken for granted, quiet mornings, shared moments, became harder to come by. The presence of a third party in their home forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. They realized that, despite all the love they shared, they hadn't fully accounted for how deeply the intrusion would affect their dynamic. What started as a noble act of service quickly tested their patience, their limits, and their bond. For him, the changes were subtle at first. His irritation was quiet, almost imperceptible, more of a simmering undercurrent than an explosion. He understood the importance of friendship, of offering support when needed, but the intrusion started to chip away at his sense of peace. His relationship with her, the one they had so carefully built, felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He wasn't just losing time, but a piece of himself. She, on the other hand, found herself stretched thin, torn between her loyalty to her friend and the needs of her partner. She had always believed in being there for others, in giving unconditionally, but now she was struggling to balance the two. She didn't want to neglect her partner, but she couldn't abandon her friend either. The guilt weighed on her heavily, and she began questioning her ability to be enough for both. As the days wore on, the house grew quieter, not with peace but with unspoken words. Their conversations had become more strained, their interactions less frequent. The comfort they once found in each other was now replaced with distance. The subtle cues they had once exchanged, those looks, those small gestures, had all but disappeared, replaced by awkward silences and forced smiles. It wasn't until one fateful evening that everything came to a head. They had just finished a long day of work, and her friend had been visibly upset, perhaps exacerbated by the ongoing tension. In an attempt to comfort her, she stayed by her side for hours, trying to console her and offer words of support. Meanwhile, he waited in the other room, growing more anxious, unable to push away the resentment that was steadily building within him. The moment finally came when he could no longer contain his frustration. He entered the room, his face stern, and addressed the issue that had been plaguing him for days. His words were sharp, raw, and filled with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. For the first time in weeks, he voiced the feelings he had been bottling up, his sense of neglect, his frustration with the situation, his fear of losing the connection they once shared. She was taken aback by his outburst, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. It felt as if the ground had shifted beneath them, and neither of them knew how to regain their footing. The air was thick with tension, and all the unresolved emotions they had been hiding from each other came rushing to the surface. She had been so focused on helping her friend that she hadn't realized how much she had neglected the needs of her partner. She saw the hurt in his eyes, and it was more than she could bear. But instead of retreating, they talked. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty. The conversation was filled with moments of silence, moments of tears, but through it all, they were honest with each other. They acknowledged their fears, their insecurities, and the mistakes they had made. It was the hardest conversation they had ever had, but it was the one they desperately needed. They realized that love wasn't just about being there for others. It was about being there for each other too. It was about finding balance, setting boundaries, and understanding that sometimes support could be given in different ways. They made a promise to communicate more, to be more aware of each other's needs, and to never let the world outside their relationship steal the peace they had built. By the time the sun set that evening, their bond was stronger than ever. The storm had passed, and the quiet that followed felt different. It wasn't the silence of distance, but the stillness of understanding. They both knew that, though the test had been difficult, they had emerged from it more united, more in tune with each other than they had been in a long time. The unexpected test had shown them that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a constant effort, a conscious choice to put each other first, no matter the external pressures. And with that understanding, they were ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, knowing that together, they could weather anything. As they sat there, side by side, in the golden light of the evening, it was as if time itself had slowed, giving them the space they needed to truly breathe. The world around them seemed distant, almost surreal. The gentle breeze caressed their faces, and the whispering of the trees seemed to speak in a language only they could understand. For a moment, everything was still. He knew that this moment, this fleeting stillness, was what they both needed. It wasn't just the words they'd exchanged, but the silence that had bound them together in ways nothing else could. There was a bond between them that felt timeless, unspoken, and yet deeply felt. It was the kind of connection that goes beyond physical touch, beyond shared experiences. It was an understanding that resonated on the most intimate level. Her heart, which had long been guarded, felt lighter. For so long, she had kept herself locked away, afraid to open up, afraid that if she allowed herself to be loved, she might lose something precious, her sense of self, her sense of safety. But here, with him, she felt no fear. There was no judgment, no pressure, just the simple truth of who they were together in this moment. The quiet between them was a comfort, but it wasn't enough. She could feel the weight of her own emotions welling up inside of her, and she knew it was time to speak, to break the silence, to let everything out. She turned her head slightly, glancing at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like forever. He was looking at her too, as though he had been waiting for her to speak, to finally open up. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to feel like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft rustling of the wind. "Like, I could finally let go of all the walls I've built around myself. I didn't think I could trust anyone again, let alone give someone my heart." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to face her fully, his expression gentle yet intense. The vulnerability in her words mirrored the quiet strength he'd seen in her over time. She wasn't just breaking down the walls, she was finding herself, piece by piece, and it was beautiful. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his voice steady and full of assurance. "I've always known you were strong, even when you didn't know it yourself. But trust is something that can't be rushed. And I'll wait, as long as it takes." Tears filled her eyes as his words settled in her heart. There was something incredibly healing about his acceptance. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she didn't feel like she had to carry the weight of her past alone. He was here, with her, and that was enough. The fear, the doubt, the years of holding herself back, all of it melted away in the presence of this man who had shown her a love that was patient, that was gentle, and that didn't ask her to be anything other than who she truly was. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly as she reached for his hand. "I'm scared of what might happen if I let go of everything. If I let myself fall for you." "You don't have to be scared," he reassured her, his grip on her hand firm and unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Whatever happens, whatever comes, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this. I won't let you go." For the first time in a long time, she believed him. His words, his presence, filled her with a sense of peace she had never known before. She had spent so long keeping herself distant, trying to protect herself from the hurt, but now, in this moment, she realized that the greatest risk she could take was to close herself off from love. And here, in his arms, in his eyes, she saw the possibility of something real, something lasting. With a deep breath, she finally allowed herself to lean in, her forehead gently resting against his. There were no more barriers between them, no more doubts or fears. It was just them, two souls intertwined in the quiet, the stillness, and the beauty of this moment. The world around them could wait. I think I'm ready," she whispered, her voice steady now, no longer filled with uncertainty. "I think I'm ready to love you." His heart swelled with emotion at her words, and in that moment, he knew that the love they shared was something beyond what words could fully express. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic proclamations. It was the quiet understanding between them, the unspoken bond that grew stronger with every shared moment, every look, and every touch. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its final rays of golden light over the savannah, they sat together, side by side, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The road ahead would not always be easy, but they had each other, and that was enough. In that silence, in that shared space, love blossomed. And for the first time in a long time, she was no longer afraid to fully embrace it.